My parents kicked me out of the house to make room for my golden sister and her child, but her loser boyfriend ran away from them. Hey everyone, before I dive into my story, I just want to ask you all for a quick favor. If you enjoy reading these, please consider subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications. The channel isn't getting as many views lately, and most people don't stick around till the end, so every bit of support really helps. Alright, let's get into it. Hi Reddit. I want to share something that has been weighing on me for years. Growing up, I lived in the shadow of my older sister, Sophie. She was the golden child, and I was, well, the extra. From as early as I can remember, it was always about her. Our parents, Andrew and Margaret, treated her like she was made of gold, while I was just some afterthought they had to deal with. I don't mean to sound bitter, but it's hard not to be when you grow up watching one person get all the praise, all the love, all the attention, while you get reprimanded for existing the wrong way. If Sophie spilled juice on the carpet, no big deal, accidents happen. If I forgot to put a dish in the sink, I was lazy and irresponsible. If she got a bad grade, it was because the teacher was unfair. If I got a bad grade, I was obviously not working hard enough. It wasn't just about grades, though. It was everything. I remember one time when I was around 10, I broke my arm falling off my bike. Mom was irritated that she had to take me to the hospital because she had to cancel Sophie's dance lesson. The entire time we were there, she kept reminding me how inconvenient I was being. Meanwhile, when Sophie sprained her ankle at dance practice a year later, they acted like it was the worst thing that had ever happened to our family. But the moment that really cemented everything for me happened when I was 14. I had been working for months on this science project for a regional competition. It was a big deal. I poured everything into it, staying after school, researching, testing my theories over and over. When the day of the competition came, I was beyond nervous. I kept looking into the audience, hoping to see my parents. I told them about it weeks in advance, reminded them, asked them to come. They weren't there. They were at Sophie's dance performance. Not some national championship, not even a solo performance. She was in the third row of a local recital. I won that competition. First place. I stood there on stage, holding my trophy, and looking out at an audience full of proud parents cheering for their kids. Except mine. When I got home that night, trophy in hand, beaming with excitement, I was met with a casual, "Oh, that's nice, honey," before they launched into a 20-minute recap of Sophie's recital. They didn't even ask to see my award. They didn't ask how it went. They didn't care. That was the first time I really, truly understood my place in the family. When I was 17, everything in our family shifted, but not in the way I hoped. Sophie came home one evening, sat our parents down with this dramatic air about her, and said, "I'm pregnant." Just like that. No build-up, no shame, just an announcement like she was telling them she got a new haircut. For a moment, I thought I misheard. I looked at my dad, expecting him to explode, to finally see the golden child fall from grace. But he just sat there, silent, staring at the floor. My mom, on the other hand, burst into tears, not of anger, not of disappointment, but of joy. Actual joy. "Oh, Sophie, this is a blessing," she sobbed. Hugging her like this was the best news she had ever heard. I was stunned. A blessing? Was she serious? Sophie was only 19. She had no job, no plan, no stability. And then there was Josh. If you could picture the embodiment of a deadbeat, it was him. He was a high school dropout with no job, no ambition, and no idea how to take care of himself, let alone a child. He was the kind of guy who thought playing video games all day was a career choice. I couldn't help myself. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of the moment hit me all at once. My whole life, I had been held to impossible standards, judged for every mistake, and now here was Sophie, making what should have been the biggest mistake of her life, and she was being celebrated for it. What's so funny? My mom snapped at me, wiping her tears. "Oh, nothing," I said, shaking my head. Just wondering what would have happened if I had come home and said I got someone pregnant. I already knew the answer. If I had been in Sophie's shoes, they would have lost their minds. They would have called me irresponsible, reckless, a disgrace. They probably would have packed me off to some strict boarding school, cut me off, made sure I suffered the consequences. But because it was Sophie, it was a blessing. My mom gave me a sharp look. "That's different," she said, as if that was an actual argument. "Different how?" I challenged, looking between her and my dad, who still hadn't said a word. "She has no job, no stability, no way to support a kid. But it's fine because it's Sophie." "Don't be cruel," my mom scolded. "She's scared and she needs our support." I almost lost it then and there. Scared and needs support. What about me? When had I ever gotten support for anything? When I broke my arm? When I won that science competition? When I tried, again and again, to be seen? I glanced at my dad again, expecting, hoping, that he would say something. that he would acknowledge how insane this was. But he just sat there, rubbing his forehead, like he wanted to be anywhere but here. That was the moment I realized something else. My dad might not worship Sophie the way my mom did, but he sure as hell wasn't going to fight for me. He wasn't going to stand up and say, "You're right, Leo. This isn't fair." No, he was just going to keep his head down, like he always did, and let it happen. Sophie wiped her fake tears, sniffling, playing the victim. "I just really need my family right now," she whispered. And just like that, the conversation was over. My mom was already fussing over her, talking about baby names, about how she'd help raise the child, about how this was all going to be wonderful. My dad still didn't say anything. And me? I was just there, watching it unfold, knowing that if I had made the same mistake, I would have been thrown to the wolves. A few weeks after Sophie's big announcement, my life was turned upside down in the most ridiculous, unfair way imaginable. My parents sat me down at the kitchen table, both looking uneasy. My mom kept glancing at my dad like she was waiting for him to say something, but as usual, he was just sitting there, rubbing his temples, avoiding my eyes. Finally, my mom cleared her throat and said, "Leo, we need to talk about something important." I already knew it was going to be bad. It always was when they used that tone. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, waiting for whatever nonsense they were about to throw at me. "Sophie will be having the baby soon," she continued carefully, still not meeting my eyes. "And with the baby coming, we need to make some space." I stared at her, not understanding where this was going. "Okay." She let out a slow breath, like she was preparing for my reaction. "We think it would be best if you moved in with Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Frank for a little while, just until things settled down." For a moment, I thought she was joking. I let out a short laugh, waiting for the punchline. But the look on her face told me this was real. "You're kicking me out." My voice was flat, but I could feel the anger creeping in. "Leo, it's not like that," my mom insisted, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away. "It's only temporary, just while Sophie and the baby get settled." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were actually sending me away. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I was a problem, but because Sophie needed my room. "You're serious?" I asked, looking between her and my dad. He still wasn't saying anything, just staring at the table like a coward. "It's for the best," my mom said softly, still refusing to look at me properly. "Your grandparents have plenty of space, and they'd love to have you." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process it. My parents, the people who were supposed to care about me, had just decided that I was so unimportant, so unnecessary, that I could be shipped off without a second thought. They weren't even asking me. They had already decided. Before I could say anything else, Sophie walked into the kitchen, stretching her arms dramatically. "Oh, so he finally knows?" She smirked and plopped down at the table like this was the most normal conversation in the world. I turned to her, furious. "You knew?" "Obviously," she said with a shrug. "It was Mom's idea. She thought it would be best for everyone." Then, with a sickeningly sweet smile, she added, "Hey, at least you won't have to hear the baby crying all night." Something in me snapped. I had spent years being treated like I didn't matter, being ignored, pushed aside, forgotten. But this was proof. I was nothing to them. An inconvenience. A piece of furniture that could be moved when it no longer fit their plans. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice low and steady, but I could feel the rage boiling underneath. "Leo, please," my mom started, but I wasn't interested in whatever weak excuse she was about to offer. I turned to my dad instead. "You really have nothing to say?" I asked him. "You're okay with this?" For the first time in the entire conversation, he looked up at me. His expression was blank, like he had already given up before the fight even started. "It's only temporary," he said quietly. I scoffed. "Yeah, sure." I knew better. Temporary meant forever in this house. They were done with me. They had their golden child, their precious grandchild on the way, and I was just taking up space. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, ignoring my mom's weak attempt to call me back. I didn't want to hear it. There was nothing they could say that would make this okay. I went upstairs, shut the door to my soon-to-be former room, and sat on my bed, staring at the walls. Everything in here, everything I had built for myself, was being taken away. And for what? So Sophie and her unemployed loser of a boyfriend could play house in comfort? That night, as I packed my things, I finally understood something I had been trying to ignore for years. I wasn't part of this family. Not really. I was just someone they had to deal with until they found a reason to get rid of me. And now they had found one. Moving to Texas felt like exile at first. I barely spoke during the flight, staring out the window and trying not to let the anger swallow me whole. My parents had made it clear I wasn't needed, wasn't wanted. They shoved me aside like I was nothing, and the worst part was that I wasn't even surprised. The realization had been creeping up on me for years, and now, finally, it was undeniable. When I arrived at my grandparents' house, Grandma Eleanor hugged me tight, holding on like she hadn't seen me in years, even though we used to visit during the summers. Grandpa Frank gave me a solid pat on the back, his way of showing warmth. Their house was old but sturdy, the kind of place that had history in every floorboard. It smelled like sawdust, coffee, and something always baking in the oven. At first, I was just numb. I barely unpacked. I went through the motions, waking up, eating, answering their questions with short sentences. My grandparents didn't push. They let me settle in at my own pace, and that was something I wasn't used to: patience, understanding. They didn't act like I was a burden or an inconvenience. They just let me exist. After about a week, Grandpa Frank asked me if I wanted to help him out in the workshop. He had always been good with his hands, fixing up old furniture, carving intricate designs into wood. I had never really paid attention before, but that day, I followed him out back. "You don't have to do anything fancy," he said, handing me a piece of sandpaper. "Just smooth this out." I worked in silence for a while, the repetitive motion calming in a way I didn't expect. The smell of sawdust, the steady scrape of sandpaper against wood, the quiet presence of my grandfather. It all felt different. Good different. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. That became our routine. Every day after school, I'd go into the workshop with him. He taught me the basics: how to measure properly, how to carve, how to repair something instead of throwing it away. It was the first time in my life I had learned something without pressure or expectations. Just curiosity. At the same time, I started spending more time on my computer. I had always been good with technology, but now I had the space to really dive into it. I fixed up an old laptop my grandparents had lying around, upgrading it piece by piece. Then I started messing around with coding, building small programs, learning how systems worked. Unlike my childhood home, where everything had been about Sophie, here I had room to grow, to explore what I actually enjoyed. One evening, my grandmother walked into the living room while I was on my computer. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Just some coding," I said, expecting the usual dismissive response I always got from my parents. But she smiled. "You've always been good with computers. Maybe you'll turn it into a career someday." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. It wasn't forced, it wasn't some half-hearted compliment. She actually believed in me. I had never felt that before. As the weeks turned into months, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving here. I was living. My grandparents cared about me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. My grandfather praised my woodworking skills. My grandmother bragged to her friends about how I could fix anything with a screen. They saw me as a person, not just an afterthought. For the first time in my life, I felt valued. At first, I thought maybe my parents would miss me, even just a little. Maybe they would call to check in, ask how I was adjusting, show some sign that I had mattered to them. But as the months passed, it became clear I was nothing more than a distant obligation, an occasional afterthought in their perfect little world. The calls started once a month, always initiated by my mom. But they weren't to talk to me. They were just an excuse to show off Ava. Every single conversation was the same. She would hold up her phone, flipping the camera to Sophie's daughter, grinning as if that was supposed to mean something to me. "Look how big she's getting," she'd say, as if I had asked. It didn't take long for me to realize that in their eyes, I had been fully replaced. The golden child had given them a new golden grandchild, and that was all they cared about. Any conversation that wasn't about Ava felt forced, awkward, something my mom was just rushing through to get back to what really mattered. My dad barely spoke, still playing the role of the quiet bystander. I stopped expecting anything from them, but they still managed to surprise me with how little they cared. When I turned 15, my birthday came and went without much thought from them. The only thing I got was a $20 Amazon gift card and an email from my mom with a generic "Happy birthday. Hope you're doing well" message. That was it. No call, no effort, just a quick digital gift card like they were checking a box on a to-do list. Meanwhile, Sophie didn't text at all. Not on my birthday, not for holidays, not even for a lazy "how's it going?" The only time I heard from her was when she needed something. If she messaged me, I already knew what it was before even opening it: money. It always started with fake warmth. "Hey Leo, long time no talk. How are things?" But I knew better. The real message always came a few lines later. "So, I hate to ask, but things have been really tight lately, and I was wondering if you could help me out." The first time she tried, I just stared at my phone in disbelief. She hadn't spoken to me in over a year, and now, suddenly, she was reaching out because she needed money? I never responded. After a few days, she sent a follow-up, acting hurt. "Wow, okay, guess you're too good for your own family now." That was when I finally understood the full picture. They didn't just replace me. They forgot about me. I wasn't part of their world anymore, unless I was useful to them. And honestly, I was fine with that. By the time I turned 18, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. Texas had become home, not just because my grandparents cared about me, but because I had finally built something for myself. I had spent years learning, growing, figuring out what I was actually good at. And it turned out, I was damn good with computers. It started small. Fixing old laptops, troubleshooting software issues, helping my grandparents' friends when their devices stopped working. What felt like a hobby at first quickly became something more. Word spread fast in a small town, and soon, people were coming to me with all sorts of tech problems. By the time I finished high school, I knew I had something real on my hands. I took a job at Best Buy right after graduation, working at the Geek Squad. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me hands-on experience with different systems, and more importantly, it connected me to people who needed help beyond what the store offered. I started taking on side jobs, repairing computers on my own time, upgrading old systems, recovering lost data. By the time I was 20, I had my first real clients, small businesses that needed IT support but couldn't afford a full-time tech team. I worked out of my grandparents' garage, using what little money I had to buy better tools and equipment. I barely slept, running on caffeine and determination. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't just working to survive. I was building something that was mine. At 22, I took the biggest leap of my life. I rented my first office, a small, barely furnished space in a strip mall, but it was mine. I had a real business now, with actual contracts, steady clients, and a reputation that was growing by the day. My first major success came not long after that. An accounting firm called me in a panic. Their entire system had crashed, and they thought they had lost years of financial records. They had no backups, no IT team, just a desperate hope that I could do something. I spent 2 straight days recovering their data, manually piecing everything back together, running on nothing but coffee and pure stubbornness. When I handed them their files, fully restored, they looked at me like I had just saved their entire world. And in a way, I had. They paid me more money than I had ever made in my life at that point, but more than that, they spread my name everywhere. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just some kid fixing computers anymore. I was a business owner, independent, free, and for the first time, I didn't care if my family knew or not. I didn't hear much about my family after I left, and I didn't go out of my way to check in. As far as I was concerned, they had made it clear where I stood, and I had no reason to look back. But small updates still trickled in, mostly through my grandmother, who still kept in touch with my parents out of obligation. Apparently, things had not been going well for them. Sophie never really got her life together. She jumped from one passion to another, never holding down a real job. One year, she was convinced she'd become an influencer and spent what little money she had on equipment she never used. Another year, she thought she'd open an Etsy shop, but she gave up after a few months when she realized running a business required actual work. No matter what, my parents always made excuses for her. Josh lasted about 3 years before he finally bailed. Not that I was surprised. He had never been the type to take responsibility for anything, and fatherhood didn't magically change that. According to my grandmother, he packed up one night and left, didn't even leave a note. Sophie was devastated for about 2 weeks before she started talking about how she was better off without him. But from what I heard, she never really recovered from the fact that even someone as useless as Josh didn't want to be tied down to her. My parents, of course, did what they always did. They threw everything they had into Sophie. Every dollar, every ounce of energy, every bit of financial security they had left went into making sure she never had to struggle. My dad had been planning to retire around 60, but that quickly became impossible. My mom refused to let Sophie feel the weight of her own mistakes, so they drained their savings, took out loans, and stretched themselves thin to keep her afloat. By the time I was 23, my dad was drowning. He had to push back retirement indefinitely because they were buried under financial stress. He worked longer hours, picked up side gigs, did whatever he could to make sure Sophie and Ava had everything they needed, while my mom continued to enable Sophie's never-ending cycle of bad decisions. I could have felt bad for them, but I didn't. They had made their choice. They had chosen their golden child over everything else, and now they were reaping what they had sown. I had spent my whole life being treated like I was disposable, and now, standing on my own 2 feet, I finally saw them for what they were. Weak, desperate people who had spent so long putting Sophie on a pedestal that they couldn't admit they had built their lives around a sinking ship. I didn't reach out. I didn't offer help. They had made it clear years ago I wasn't their priority. And now, they weren't mine either. I hadn't heard from my parents in years. Not really. Aside from the occasional obligatory check-in from my mom, always centered around Ava, there had been no effort to reconnect. They had long since made their choice, and I had moved on. Then, Out of nowhere, my phone rang. It was my mom's number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me was curious. I hadn't spoken to them in over a decade in any real capacity, and I had no doubt this wasn't a social call. When I answered, there was a long pause before my mom spoke. "Leo," she said, her voice shaky. "We need help." I leaned back in my chair, already bracing myself. "Help," I repeated. She let out a deep sigh, the kind people make when they want sympathy. "It's Sophie. She had an accident. A really bad one." I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "She broke her leg and her hip," my mom explained, her voice thick with stress. "She can't walk. She needs full-time care, and we can't do it on our own." I stayed silent, waiting for the inevitable. "Josh is gone," she continued, sounding exhausted. "He stopped even pretending to care. He won't take Ava for weekends anymore. He won't answer our calls. He's completely out of the picture. Your father and I, we're too old for this. We've done everything we can, but we're struggling." She hesitated, then finally said it. "Leo, we need you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the sheer audacity of it. They had pushed me out of their lives, treated me like I was nothing, ignored my existence unless it benefited them. And now, suddenly, when their golden child was too broken to take care of herself, they were reaching out? "I see," I said, my voice calm. "And what exactly do you want from me?" She took a deep breath. "Just come back for a little while. Help us. Help your sister. You have the resources, and your family." Family. That word had never felt so hollow. I sat there for a moment, staring at my office window, looking at everything I had built for myself. I had a business, a life, a future I had carved out without them. And now they expected me to drop everything because Sophie, the child they had worshipped at my expense, needed help? "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You ignored me for years. You forgot my birthdays. You only ever called to show me pictures of Ava. The only time Sophie ever texted was when she wanted money. And now, because you're out of options, you think I owe you something?" My mother made a small, strangled sound. "Leo, it's not like that." "It's exactly like that," I said firmly. "You made your choice. You built your lives around Sophie. You spent everything on her, ignored every warning sign. And now that it's all falling apart, you're expecting me to step in and clean up the mess." She sniffled. "We just thought." "No," I interrupted. "You didn't think about me at all. Not for years. And now you want my help? That's not how this works." There was silence on the other end. "I hope Sophie recovers," I said, my voice flat. "But that's your problem, not mine." And with that, I hung up. I sat there for a long time, letting the weight of the moment sink in. A younger version of me might have felt guilty, might have wondered if I was being too harsh. But now, at 27, I knew better. I owed them nothing. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I had nothing left in that place, nothing tying me to the people who had cast me aside so easily. But there was one reason I reconsidered: Ava. She was the only innocent one in all of this. She hadn't asked to be born into the disaster Sophie had created, and if she was suffering because of their failures, then maybe, just maybe, I could do something. But I had conditions. I would help, but not as their son, not as Sophie's brother, and certainly not as some long-lost family member returning home. Because I wasn't coming home. I booked a hotel the moment I landed. There was no way I was staying in that house, no matter how much my mother pleaded over the phone when she found out. "Leo, that's ridiculous. You don't need to waste money on a hotel. We have plenty of space," she said, her voice laced with desperation. I didn't even argue. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said simply before hanging up. The next morning, I drove to their house for the first time in 10 years. Nothing had changed, and that somehow made it worse. The same paint, the same yard, even the same old wind chimes on the porch. It was like stepping into a time capsule of my own neglect. When I walked inside, I wasn't sure what to expect. Tears? Apologies? Some dramatic reunion? But no, Sophie was sitting on the couch, her leg in a brace, scrolling through her phone like I was just another person walking into the house. She barely glanced up. "Oh, you're really here?" she muttered, completely uninterested. I stopped in the doorway, looking at her, at the crutches propped up beside her, at the mess around her, a mess my mother was probably still cleaning up for her. That was all she had to say. No acknowledgement of the fact that she hadn't spoken to me in years. No embarrassment over the fact that I had to be begged to come back. I shouldn't have been surprised. My parents, on the other hand, looked confused, like they weren't sure how to act around me. My mother kept trying to reach out, fuss over me, act like nothing had happened, but I shut it down every time. My father, who had spent my childhood as nothing more than a silent bystander, seemed to sense that things weren't the same. And they weren't. "I need to make something clear," I said, standing in their living room, looking directly at my father. "I am not here for Sophie. I am not here to fix your mistakes. I am here for Ava, and if you want my help, it will go through you, not her." Not Mom. My mother gasped. Leo. No, I cut her off. You don't get to act like things are normal. You threw me away for her, and now you need me. I get it. But I will not be manipulated into thinking this is about family. If Ava needs something, I will handle it through Dad. That's it. Sophie finally looked up, rolling her eyes. Oh my God, don't be so dramatic. I turned to her, my expression unreadable. You think this is dramatic? You should be grateful I'm even standing in this house. She scoffed, but didn't say anything else. My father exhaled, rubbing his face like he was carrying the weight of the world. I understand, he said quietly. I appreciate whatever you're willing to do. That was all I needed. I wasn't there for them. I wasn't there for Sophie. I was there for a little girl who had been failed by everyone around her. And I would make sure she didn't grow up thinking she was nothing. Ava was the only part of this whole mess that felt real. She was 10 now, bright-eyed and full of curiosity. The first time we talked, she was shy, hesitant, like she wasn't sure what to make of me. But once she realized I wasn't just another adult who spoke to her like a child, she warmed up quickly. She was sharp, quick-witted, and, to my surprise, interested in programming. I like figuring things out, she told me one afternoon while I was showing her some basic coding. It's like solving a puzzle. Hearing that made something tighten in my chest. I saw pieces of myself in her. The same drive, the same need to create something of her own. Unlike Sophie, who had been handed everything and still wasted it, Ava actually wanted to learn, to grow. And for the first time, I realized that maybe my coming back hadn't been a complete waste of time. Sophie, of course, didn't see it that way. As soon as she realized I wasn't handing out money, her attitude shifted. She was always bitter, always rolling her eyes whenever I came over. At first, she tried to be fake sweet, casually bringing up how tight things were for her, how helping family was so important. But when I didn't bite, her frustration turned to open hostility. I don't get why you're even here if you're not going to help, she muttered one day, watching as I helped Ava with a math problem. I didn't even look at her. I am helping. Her lips curled in annoyance. Yeah, but not with anything that actually matters. I let out a short laugh. Oh, I think it matters a lot. She scoffed, crossing her arms like a sulking teenager. Whatever. Her bitterness didn't bother me. It was just confirmation that she had learned nothing. She had spent her whole life expecting the world to bend to her needs, and now, finally, there was someone telling her no. But the moment that stuck with me the most came from someone I least expected. One evening, my dad pulled me aside as I was getting ready to leave. He looked tired, older than I remembered, like the weight of his choices had finally settled on him. I should have protected you, he said quietly, his voice heavy. Not followed your mother's lead. For a second, I didn't know what to say. He had spent my entire childhood looking the other way, standing silently while my mom worshipped Sophie and treated me like I was just extra. And now, after all these years, he was finally admitting it. I didn't feel angry. Not anymore. That ship had sailed a long time ago. I just felt regret. Regret for what could have been, for what he could have done if he had just spoken up, if he had just chosen to be my father instead of Sophie's silent cheerleader. I nodded once, accepting his words for what they were. An apology far too late to change anything. The next morning, I left. I flew back to Texas, back to my life, back to everything I had built for myself. And as I sat in my office, looking at the space that was truly mine, I knew one thing for certain. I would never be just a backup for them again. So what do you guys think? Was I too harsh? Should I have done more? Or did I do exactly what they deserved? I don't regret walking away, but I can't help but wonder how things would have turned out if they had treated me differently from the start. Would love to hear your thoughts.